Back with our lead story now, and to talk more on the relationship between India and South Africa, we're joined by Elizabeth Sidiropoulos from the South African Institute of International Affairs. A very good evening to you, Elizabeth. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, before this point, what was the state of South Africa and Indian relations?
Well, I think they've always been very important at a political level. The very first visit at a summit level came during the presidency of Nelson Mandela in the 1990s. So there's always been a political engagement. There has been an increasing economic engagement, certainly since 1994, and an increasing number of Indian companies investing in South Africa and vice versa. I think the challenge is that the relationship can be much more than what it is at the moment, both from a trade perspective, also potentially from a political cooperation, also at the global level. There are numerous opportunities, and most certainly also in the investment field. And I think some of the outcomes of the meeting today, and indeed leading up to the meeting also from last year, some of the initiatives around business are about trying to get that relationship on a different footing in terms of the speed of economic and political ties.
Now, Liz, India and South Africa are both BRICS members. So do these bilateral ties perhaps strengthen the impact of BRICS in these two countries?
I think it's always important to differentiate between the bilateral relationship and the relationship within a grouping. And I think perhaps when we joined the BRICS, with some of these relationships, and I would argue both with India and with Brazil, we probably erred on the side of saying, well, we're part of the BRICS, we're actually meeting at a heads of state level, twice a year. They meet at the BRICS summit. They meet at the UN General Assembly in September. But I think nothing beats the actual bilateral high-level engagements like we're seeing today. The actual holding of the ministerial meetings, the joint ministerial meetings. The next one, which will be held in 2019, because those allow you to focus specifically on the issues that pertain to the two countries that are part of that process, rather than trying to look at it in a grouping like the BRICS. That doesn't mean that, of course, being part of the BRICS doesn't give it a different kind of impetus and elevates the degree of cooperation, because there are obviously certain things that work much better in terms of cooperation when you're doing it with five countries that have that adopt particular positions on certain issues, whether it's in UN fora or trade fora or whatever the case might be. But this is important. We cannot underestimate, we cannot have the one and not have the other. And so this is very important. This meeting.
Indeed, Elizabeth. Now, speaking of beneficiation and the cooperation of five countries, you actually wrote a very thought-provoking article about South African-India relations, wherein you touched on Prime Minister Narendra Modi's economic diplomacy that advances Indian activity at home, covering a wide range of sectors from automobiles and components to electronic systems to food processing. So how does the potential impact of Africa's beneficiation add value to Africa's raw materials to avoid a situation where they are being exported to other countries and then Africa, particularly South Africa, buys those goods at higher prices?
I think from an Indian perspective, Prime Minister Modi's Make in India was also about stimulating the Indian economy, allowing it to move, enabling it to move into manufacturing areas where it may not have, where there was significant potential, but where it hadn't been, its economic trajectory hadn't necessarily focused on. India's economic growth over the last 25 years since it began its reform process is obviously largely focused on the services. So Make in India, one can argue, is a process that doesn't help industrialization in Africa. But I think India, over the course of Prime Minister Modi's term in office, has also become increasingly attuned to the importance that if we're looking at, as India, if India is looking at increasing its cooperation and its partnership with Africa and making inroads into Africa, and certainly South Africa is an important pivot in that regard, it also needs to be aware and to work together with other African countries in addressing some of the priorities that are important to Africa in terms of Africa's development and industrialization. If you look at specifically, if you look at the at South Africa and the statement that came out of the meeting this evening, you'll see that in fact in a number of areas they've identified in the manufacturing industrial sector, they've identified exploring areas of cooperation or deepening that. Some of it, for example, speaks to working together on SMME development, which is absolutely critical for us if we're going to deal with our triple challenge of inequality, unemployment, and poverty. There's also significant cooperation in defense. There is great potential in the science and technology sectors, and these are all incorporated in the outcome document. I think what is also equally important is that there are over 150 Indian companies active in South Africa and the region, and that these they have manufacturing plants. So pharmaceutical companies are also present. So it's not just about trade, and in fact, trade between the two countries in the last 7 or 8 years has declined, but investment has actually increased. So I think that's the lesson, and from that relationship, that trade actually is not what we should only be focusing on, but in fact we should be very pleased that there has been a deepening of investment, an area where South Africa and the region more broadly actually really needs countries, emerging economies like India, which has now surpassed China in terms of annual economic growth. We need them in terms of helping with our own priorities around industrialization and economic development.
And speaking of India surpassing China through economic growth, I mean, some pundits have actually been saying that it is actually becoming the world's fastest growing economy in 2018 with the 8.4% GDP rate. So what does it mean? What kind of impact would such enormous growth have on the BRICS partners?
Well, of course, I mean, India is still not, its economy is not that of China's yet. And so while China is growing at a slightly slower rate than India, it is still a much larger economy. And therefore, the impact of China's much slower growth than we had seen, say, 5 or 6 years ago is still much more significant than India's. But the fact is that India is the next rising emerging power in terms of overtaking some of the Western economies over the next decade and a half. And so from a South African perspective, if we're also looking at economic diplomacy, commercial diplomacy being at the heart of our international engagements, if we want to deal with unemployment, if we want to deal with poverty and so on and so forth, India is clearly, a partner that doesn't require rocket science to say we actually need to be working much more closely together and exploring economic opportunities much more. And certainly in terms of creating a business environment that attracts more Indian investors, and this was also something that was discussed today, because they can actually play a critical role not only in stimulating and creating more jobs, but also in the value chain, in the manufacturing value chain, and our small and medium enterprises being able to plug into that value chain facilitated by investment in different sectors, whether it's in the automotive or the pharmaceutical or defense or telephony or any number of sectors.
What is it that India is getting right that its fellow African countries can learn from?
Well, I mean, I think the first the first issue here is that, as with China, these processes of economic development and setting off on a path of economic development take a long time. So India began with its significant reform processes of its economy in the early 1990s. There've been stops and starts, but also particularly under this Prime Minister, who has focused quite single-mindedly on creating a better business environment, removing more and more of the barriers within India that actually precluded from being a huge single market. As an Indian friend says, India sometimes is a bit like the European Union. You think it is a single market, but sometimes there are a lot of barriers to doing trade even within states, that actually also makes it very difficult for investors to go in. But it's also had a very strong, for many decades, a very strong educational sector, high-tech training, institutes of technology that I think we can learn a lot from. And indeed, that's been an area where India has been a strong partner of not only South Africa, but also of many other African countries in terms of building human resource capacity. And in fact, one of the initiatives in the early days of NEPAD was indeed rolling out electronic connections to hospitals in India to be able to take healthcare services into rural areas. So there are a number of issues. I would say possibly education critical, but also the ability to create a business-friendly environment, which is still a challenge, I think, in India, but which Prime Minister Modi has done a significant amount to make it easier, both for Indian businesses, but also for investors, for foreign investors.
In order for India to be a superpower in the 21st century, I mean, it needs to definitely develop its military, its military capabilities and diminish its dependence on natural resources. Now, I'm curious to know, Liz, why is it always the fact that, a determination of a global superpower is its military prowess?
Well, it's a combination of powers. So military is important because the military power gives you the ability to project hard power. But as we know, increasingly it's not. It's also about soft power, and I think India has a significant amount of that, and it's about your economic strength, and it's a combination of those three that actually make a country a significant global player. And some may become superpowers, others may simply be great powers or regional powers. It means that you can operate at all levels in the international relations field, because we also know that as much as we may not be bellicose, or prefer a much more peaceful global system, that military power is one of the many tools that countries have at their disposal, not only in terms of being able to protect their borders, but also in terms, unfortunately, if we believe in realpolitik, of being able to influence developments in their region or even beyond. And I think that's why it's important. I think it's still on its way to becoming a superpower. It's most definitely an increasingly important economic player. And India is also building up its military prowess, and of course it's a nuclear power. What is interesting in the statement that came out of the meeting between President Ramaphosa and Prime Minister Modi today was the focus on defense and naval cooperation between the two countries, and I think in that context it's useful to remember, that we both have strategic interests in the Indian Ocean, and that we're both part of the Indian Ocean Rim Association, which I think under the chairmanship of India a few years ago was resuscitated, and India gave it a very strong sort of focus and mandate, which was then taken on by the Australians, and certainly in the context of the blue economy has continued under South Africa's current chairmanship of the Indian Ocean Rim Association. And I think from an Indian perspective, I think there is also the issue of geostrategic, geopolitical rivalry with China, both in its northern borders, but then also in terms of China's presence in the Indian Ocean. So India is also very much a naval power, just by dint of the fact that it straddles a significant part of the Indian Ocean.
You know, Liz, speaking of that rivalry between India and China, I would like us to extend our analysis to the economic, or rather the trading model between India and African continent. How does it differ from the Chinese model? I mean, we all know that China has been heavily criticized for its model, which ostensibly is aimed at recolonizing the continent.
Well, you know, I think on some fronts, India has probably been equally interested in Africa's minerals and resources. For example, India was present in Sudan, one of the first investors in the oil fields there, and while China came in for quite a significant amount of criticism, India was able to avoid that. I think part of it is also the way in which I think countries and the world sees India. It's seen as a democratic country and also a country where, in terms of its investments, many of these investments are undertaken by private individuals. You know, there is it's not like the Chinese approach, where a lot of these companies, particularly in the resources sector, are actually state-owned and drive a particular state set of national interest dictated by the state. So India has a number of private companies, many of them who have been present on the African continent for many, many years. This is not new. You know, India has had a presence, or Indian actors have had a significant presence on the continent, both on the East Coast as well as on the West Coast, and most definitely in South Africa for many, many years. And of course, there's also significant diaspora, not least in South Africa, but also historically in East Africa and a little bit in West Africa. It's also not been of the scale that the Chinese economic presence, both in terms of trade and investment, have been, or more specifically, China's case, obviously a lot of construction contracts related to building of infrastructure, which also makes it quite public and quite apparent. But I think the most significant has been that its approach also in terms of creating not the most significant, but the approach it has taken compared to China in terms of creating a platform, a forum for bringing together African states and India, has taken a different trajectory to what China has done. So China has had the FOCAC process since 2000, the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. It meets every 3 years. It's really, it's all, all African countries are invited, at least all of them who recognize the One China policy. In the case of India, India came to the game in 2008. That was the first time they had the India-Africa Forum Summit. And the approach was based on the decision taken by the AU, what was called the Banjul process, the Banjul Declaration, which said that the meetings between Africa and India would be with the African Union, it would be with the chairs of the regional economic communities who would in effect then represent the continent. So it wouldn't be everybody. The first time this differed was, of course, the last India-Africa Forum Summit, which was a couple of years ago, where all the countries were invited. And I think this was also driven by India's, I think, desire to
all right.
To build a stronger partnership with all African countries, at least at a high public platform in the way that China has done, rather than sort of this much smaller India-Africa Forum Summit where you might have had 15 or 16 heads of state at any one time.
All right, Liz, thank you so much for your wide-ranging and thought-provoking analysis. We appreciate it. That was Elizabeth Sidiropoulos from the South African Institute of International Affairs.